Good day, everyone. So, as Paul said, I'm a trade union organiser. I actually originally was planning to become an academic. I was very interested in inequality and migration about 20 years ago, but I became involved in the trade union movement, and just because of my own particular skill set, I thought that I'd be better off there because I'm very interested in organising workers to achieve better outcomes for themselves. So I think Professor Wickham invited me here to complement the previous speaker's presentation on wage-led growth. And I'm going to speak from a practitioner's perspective about the work that we're doing in SIPTU and indeed across the Irish Congress of Trade Unions at the moment to tackle wages, but particularly the people that I work with. I lead a team of 25 trade union organisers and approximately 900 trade union shop stewards who are tackling the very issues of wage inequality, gender pay inequality, and the casualisation of work and working hours. So I'm going to talk about those issues. The work that I refer to is not all my own, it's work that's done by my colleagues as well. So I suppose in the work that we do in the private sector services industries, and I don't think anyone would disagree that that is the most challenging area for trade unions. It's the most union hostile of industries, and it is the part of industry that has had the most significant attacks in terms of regulating the labour market. The work that we do really is in three strands. The first one is to organise workers into our union. That's becoming increasingly challenging. I'll talk a little bit about why that might be. And when they join our union, to organise their workplaces. And the reason why we want to do that is we want to put workers into the best possible position with the most leverage to engage in collective bargaining with their employers. So that's the first thing we do, organising workers. The second thing we do is to engage in collective bargaining. And I think it's really significant to say, because we're going through a difficult time in Ireland over the last 10 or 20 years in terms of hostility towards trade unions, particularly from the establishment media. It's really important that I would say, I think, that our priorities at the bargaining table are always set by the workers in the particular industry or in the enterprise or in the company or in the department in which we're bargaining. So the workers themselves, our members, set the agenda for the issues that we tackle at the table. And I suppose the third thing then that we do is that we campaign and we lobby and we educate and we agitate for a more worker-friendly regulatory framework for us to engage in collective bargaining. And sometimes that is also a legislative framework. And as I'm going to talk about in the presentation, in recent years in Ireland, because of the legislative attacks on the mechanisms for collective bargaining, we've had to really be very engaged in legislative change campaigning. So why do unions exist at all? What's the raison d'etre for trade unions? I think it's important that I frame the next 25 minutes of my conversation in saying the reasons why workers form trade unions and why trade unions need to exist is that there's an inherent inequality of bargaining power in the employment relationship. So what does that mean? Tony Wedderburn, for people who are interested in labour law, QC in the UK, writer of quite a significant book, The Worker and the Law, he gave us this good insight into that inequality of bargaining power when he said in 1986 that the common law assumes it's dealing with a contract made between equals. But in reality, save in very exceptional circumstances, so people that are extremely highly skilled in skills that are very rare in the labour market, okay, the individual worker brings no inequality of bargaining power to the labour market and to this transaction central to her life, whereby the employer buys his labour, his or her labour. The reason why trade unions exist at all is the is the inequality in bargaining power in setting wages and conditions. And then Can Freund, who's also a very significant commentator on labour law issues, said to us that the employment relationship in its essence is an act of submission. In its operation, it's a condition of subordination, however much the submission and the subordination may be concealed by that indispensable figment of the legal mind known as the contract of employment. I've been working as a trade union organiser for 17 years, and I've been involved in left-wing and trade union activism as a volunteer for a number of years before that. I have seen a trend over that time for workers to increasingly expect that the answer to their problems at work are found in labour legislation. Isn't there some law that can protect me from them doing this to me, or to protect us? And I notice a generational aspect to that, in that younger workers are more likely, in my personal experience, to say, surely there's some law that can stop them from doing that, cutting my wages, changing my hours, giving me a very casual or 0 hours contract. And as trade union officials, of course, and as people in this room interested in inequality issues, the answer to that generally is no, there isn't a law to protect you in the labour market. So very often our conversations with workers now are about educating them to that fact. I think the education system that workers come through at secondary level does not prepare them for that stark reality when they enter the labour market. In fact, I think people are maybe educated and socialised now to think that in individual rights and individual employment rights is the answer to their problems, but of course it isn't, as the professor said, and as we know. So why do workers need unions? Well, despite the enactment of legislation to deal with worker protection, the inequality of bargaining power remains the enduring feature of the industrial landscape in Ireland. In my experience, this is more so today than it's ever been since I've been involved in trade unionism, and it's getting increasingly worse. The other thing that's happening in the Irish labour market, in my division in SIPTU, in our membership, nearly 1 in 3 members is a migrant worker. And very often they're coming from countries with a much different industrial relations system to ours, where workers have more protections, for example, from Eastern European countries. And for example, the Polish system gives much stronger protections to individual and collective workers. And when those Polish workers approach us, very often they say, can you not take a case for me to get my wages increased? But no is the answer in this country. That's not how we're going to deal with wage-led growth. There's no case we can take. So what do unions do? This is a really old image from the trade union movement that I go back to over and over again because it's so sublime, I think. Unions help to equalise the relative power imbalance in bargaining power in the labour market and in a given employment. And how do unions do that? They do that by bringing people together. So it's big fish and small fish. And I want to say at this point that there is a very demonstrable in the research, if you want to look at research on trade unionism and collective bargaining outcomes, there is a very demonstrable relationship between the number of people who are in a union or in a bargaining unit and the outcome of the bargaining that takes place, whether that's in a company or in an industry or in a sector, public sector or private sector. That's why it's really not good for income redistribution or tackling inequality when less people join unions. And that's why anyone, I would argue, that's interested in a more equal society should encourage unionisation. And although you may not always agree with the outcomes of our bargaining, it's important to understand that the outcome relates to how many people are in a union, or what we call union density. When that declines in an economy or in a society, wage inequality and all sorts of other inequalities increase. I am noticing in recent times more optimism and some more positive feeling towards trade unions amongst young people. And this gives me a cause for hope. I recently organised the national women's soccer team. Very young women, all women, as it happens. I'm not often in situations where it's all women in the labour movement. But I did notice a lot of very positive reaction in society, and particularly from young women and from young men, to the decision of the national women's soccer team to join a union. And, it might be illegal to name who that big fish would be in that setting, but I think he's a household name. And people know, that you need to equalise that relationship by a lot of young women coming together and taking a very brave stance to go into Liberty Hall, that iconic building associated with the labour movement for 100 years, and declare that they were unionising. And the reaction to that was very positive, and it gave me quite a bit of hope. To go back to the point made by Rory and made by the professor on state regulation and state intervention, yes, absolutely, categorically, the state needs to intervene in the industrial relations system. So I say here in this slide that absent the countervailing influence of independent trade unions, and there is an issue in this country with certain indigenous and multinational companies who are anti-union, trying to dress up their management systems as trade unions. So we need to be really careful to always understand that workers are entitled to form trade unions independent to their management. So without independent trade unions and collective bargaining, the only other bulwark against the inequality of bargaining power in the workplace is the role of the state in statutory regulation of the protection of workers. And here I'm particularly interested in people at the lower end of the labour market. Now, I'm a socialist, and you may not expect me to quote a Fianna Fáil Taoiseach in this presentation, but in the week that's in it, and given the remarks, the very strident remarks by our new Taoiseach in relation to public sector workers, in their rights to be in unions and to take lawful industrial action, I think it is fitting that I would quote Sean Lemass from the 1930s, and to say, and I do this not because I'm a huge Sean Lemass fan, but I want to demonstrate to you how far the worsening attitude towards trade unionism has come between the 1930s and now in this country. So Lemass said in 1935, when he was Minister for Enterprise, the whole purpose of the series of measures, essentially the new Free State was putting in place its industrial relations machinery, replacing it with the machinery that had been there in colonial times. So the whole purpose of the series of measures which we propose to institute in relation to all occupations where undesirable exploitation of labour might occur is a machinery for the regulation of working conditions, which will prevent abuses and which will enable the state to exercise a general supervision over these conditions of employment. It is recognised in all countries at the present time that it is necessary to have such legislation and that the state must exercise the function of maintaining supervision over conditions in which its citizens are employed. That was the view of the state in the 1930s. I don't think that that's the view of the state now. And this is, sometimes I think the young people that I organise, I'm very interested in organising young workers, and I have kids and I hang around with them, and sometimes people think there's a trajectory of progress, that things are always going to get better, that the next generation, that we leave the labour market and society in a better state for our children than what we got it. That's not the case, unfortunately, in Ireland. The labour market that young people are entering now is significantly more brutal and hostile than it was even in the 1930s, I would argue. So, given this context in the 1930s, what the state went on to do in the very low-paid industries was in 1946 to introduce the Industrial Relations Act, many aspects of which I love, many aspects of which I hate, but one specific provision related to joint labour committees. And in effect, what the 1946 Act gave was a substitute for collective bargaining in certain industries, or an underpinning of collective bargaining at national level in the industries with a propensity for exploitation. And it was specifically said at that time that that's what the joint labour committees were for, and in industries with very low levels of trade union organisation. I've just come from the ILO Congress in Geneva. There is a global recognition that certain industries are extremely difficult to organise for trade unions. Agriculture is very difficult to organise in, agricultural labours across the world. The hospitality industry is very difficult to organise in. And what the state recognised at that time was that these industries were more difficult in which to organise than, for example, in the public sector. And I'm not saying it's easy to organise in the public sector. I'm saying it's more difficult to organise in the private sector. So the JLC system afforded workers and employers in the industry covered the best available opportunity to bargain collectively on the appropriate wage floor and statutory conditions for their particular industries. So what we saw then over the decades was the setting up of joint labour committees, for example, in the retail industry, in hotels, in catering, contract cleaning, agriculture, hairdressing, aerated waters. The industries that we know, that they know are difficult to organise in, because the state recognised that unions would not always be able to get to the level of density to get the collective bargaining outcomes that workers and their families and communities needed to earn living wages and to support decent lives. So effectively, what did that do? It took wages out of competition. Now, I organise in industries that are competitive by nature. I organise in the contract services industries, where an employer decides that they're no longer going to engage, for example, in cleaning their buildings. And they contract out that work, and they contract in a contract catering company. And they work under a contract, and that contract is subject to renewal, generally in this country every 3 years. So the very essence of the industry is competition. There are a number of contract catering companies operate in the country, and they compete against each other to win contracts. That's also the case, for example, in contract catering, where people decide having a canteen is no longer their core business and feeding the people who work in their building. Or, for example, in security. These are the big three contracted industries in our country. When the competitive tendering revolves around competing on wages, it's a really bad situation for workers, because competing contractors are going to try to win contracts by driving down wages and having lower labour cost. So the benefit of having national sectoral bargaining in those industries is you literally take wages out of competition, because you set a statutory floor that they all have to pay. It is illegal for them to not pay that wage, so they can't compete on that. And they're forced to move in, the employers are, move on to the pitch of competing on productivity. That's not a dirty word for trade unions. I'm not a trade unionist who has a difficulty with engaging in productivity discussions. In fact, I think we should own productivity as trade unionists. I think that we should be the ones demanding conversations about productivity and fair recompense for our productivity. On the 7th of July 2011, a day I will never forget, the collective bargaining landscape for low-paid private sector workers in Ireland changes utterly. So what happens on that day is John Grace's fried chicken is a front for the Quick Service Food Alliance, which is a group of fast food employers who get together and say, we're not sitting down anymore with those workers and their unions to bargain pay and conditions. We own those jobs. They don't own them. We own them. They're our property. And we're going to go to the High Court and say that they can't force us to pay certain wages and apply certain rosters on jobs that we own. this is the most extreme assault on working conditions, and a really extreme, I have to say to you, globally extreme version, neoliberal view of jobs and employees. It's very extreme. So they argue they're unconstitutional based on their property rights. The state tries to defend the JLC system, but Mr. Justice Kevin Feeney, in his wisdom, not only tells the restaurant and catering employers that they don't have to engage in collective bargaining with unions, he tore up the entire Joint Labour Committee system for hundreds of thousands of workers. Reacting to this decision, IBEC, the employers' trade union, welcomed the decision, saying the entire Joint Labour Committee system is an anachronism and should be abolished. Just go back and think again about Sean Lemass in the 1930s and what he was saying about wage setting. And now we have IBEC in 2011 in this position, backing a group of extreme, I would say they're the Taliban of the employers, dragging us all into this appalling race to the bottom, which has subsequently happened in the Irish labour market. The state does put the JLC system back on a constitutional footing, but it's voluntary. Voluntarily, no, not voluntarily. The contract cleaning and the security industries enter into a joint labour committee system because we have high trade union density and we have the leverage to force them in. Force would be too strong a word. I think the employers in that industry actually do fully acknowledge that taking wages out of competition is of benefit for them too. So they go in, as do the hairdressers and the barbers, but unfortunately the hotels, catering, restaurant, retail and agriculture industries veto the system. So we have no national sectoral collective bargaining in those industries. And these are the big power industries, employee-wise, numbers-wise, in the private sector in Ireland. I want to say something about the hospitality industry. I think it's an outrage that when the hospitality industry refuses to cooperate with the state's wage setting mechanism, that they are given a preferential VAT rate since 2011 at an enormous cost to you and me and the taxpayer, as well as being subsidised in their strategy of driving wages and conditions to the bottom. They're subsidised in that a lot of their training is done by the state. They have the benefit of the state tourism bodies, but most fundamentally, a very significant proportion of workers in that industry are forced to claim family income supplement because they cannot afford to live on the poverty wages that have resulted in the dismantling of the Joint Labour Committee system and the state allowing those employers to veto it. In contract cleaning, how long have I left, Paul?
Nearly 2 minutes.
Okay. In contract cleaning, where we do bargain, on St. Stephen's Day in 2016, I remember ringing James and berating the Irish media over this. A new wage agreement and conditions agreement came in for contract cleaners, the overwhelming majority of whom are women. This is a women workers' wage agreement for the most part. I hope now none of my male members watch this video back and they will take me up on that. But this industry is like 95% female, 30,000 workers, and a very large number of quite vulnerable migrant workers. So this is a real intervention in the livelihoods and incomes of those workers and their families, often led by women. So we get a 10% pay increase over the duration of the agreement, 3 years. But, you know, wages are very significant for low-paid workers, but in my experience, they're not always the issue that make their hearts beat. And the issue that makes a contract cleaner's heartbeat is that when they put on their uniform, they become invisible to the public and they become disrespected. And in Ireland, over a number of years previous to this agreement, they had to pay to wear their employer's uniform. I know. disrespect upon disrespect. So actually for contract cleaners, what they celebrated, more than the 10% pay increase in many ways, was a bit of respect and recognition in not having to pay for their uniform. I wanted to make this point, and this I might say something that will not, many of you mightn't agree with this, but as a trade unionist, I am more committed to collectively bargained wages and conditions than statutory living wages. Because a statutory living wage of £11.50 an hour, which is what the aspiration is in Ireland at the moment, will do nothing about uniforms. And it won't address working hours. And it won't get people decent rosters. And it won't get people respect. So as a trade union, I understand that Social Democrats and other people commenting on the labour market like the idea of statutory living wages. How do workers deal with the other issues that are of importance to them? And I would argue currently in these industries that the two big issues for workers, and I know this because I meet them every day and they tell me, are working hours and wages, not just wages. Because you could earn £11.50 an hour and get 3 hours work a week in an industry where there isn't regulation of working hours. We can have a conversation about that. People might have other views on it. No media coverage whatsoever because it was a good news trade union story. My union has engaged in industrial and strike action to achieve pay increases for workers in other sectors, most notably perhaps in the transport sector recently. And we have really set the agenda in wage rises, I think, in SIPTU. But the coverage of those strikes, you can't get away from it. 30,000 women and migrant women get a pay increase of 10%, there's no coverage. That's another example, I think, of the deteriorating attitude towards trade unions in the society and in the media. In the security industry, this is mainly men, about 17,000 workers. Just a few days ago, the 1st of June, we got a new agreement for an 8.4% increase. And these workers achieved the living wage through collective bargaining by the end of their agreement. But most significantly, I would say, they ban 0 hours contracts from their industry and get a new minimum working hours, weekly working hours of 24 hours. We engage in enterprise bargaining, obviously, as well as national sectoral bargaining in the Services Division. We have collective bargaining coverage of about 60,000 workers, and the issues that we're dealing with, led by our members, currently are restoring pay cuts during the recession, increasing pay, fighting casualisation, the very reason my union was formed over 100 years ago, increasing working hours, providing more certainty of working hours, providing more certainty of rosters, equalising pay for young people, and protecting occupational pensions. Very finally, we also engage in campaigning to change the legislative and regulatory framework. And we're back to my fish here. Anyone who knows me, maybe I use this symbol too much, but it just conveys a good message. We recently, a couple of weeks ago, got a new piece of legislation that, when I was at the ILO, is attracting enormous international interest. And it is a piece of legislation to give collective bargaining rights to freelance workers. The reason why this is important, and I really hope that freelance workers in the gig economy and in the shared economy decide to unionise so we can organise them to get better wages and secure contracts. That is why it's attracting so much attention. Ireland's one of the first countries to legislate for good legislation for freelance and shared economy workers. We're currently engaging with the government, and we have a commitment for legislation in the coming months to ban 0 hours contracts, to give more certainty of working hours, and to give minimum payments for call-in for hours. Very significant issue in the private sector. As Paul said, I led the Justice for Clerys Workers Campaign, so we need to change the legislation so that can never happen again. And we're also trying to introduce better legislation for apprentices. There is a strong commitment in the country to apprentices now, but the trade union movement has been sidelined entirely from involvement with setting the wages and conditions of apprentices. Our fear is that apprentices will be used to undermine will be abused to undermine established unionised rates.
Because there's some very people who want to get in with questions later.
Thank you, Paul.
We have just about 7 or 8 minutes before we have to finish. So it's over to you to ask questions.
Hugh Brennan from O'Coolan Co-Housing Alliance. As far as I know, we're the only organisation delivering affordable housing in the country. I want somebody to contradict me somewhere in the country, but as far as I know, in the middle of a housing crisis, we're the only organisation delivering affordable housing. The title here is Economic Inequality and the Housing Crisis, okay? So I just want to address something that Ethel said and that I think Jim said, and it is about the wage rise and the wages, etc. It's not necessarily wage rises, it's a better disposable income and discretionary disposable income. And how can you achieve that? One very easy way, by introducing proper affordable housing. In our first scheme, half of our members are renting at the moment. The rest are living with their families and brothers and sisters and God knows what else. Half of them are renting and they're paying on average €1,400 per month, some a lot more. When they move into our houses, starting next week, their mortgages are going to be less than €900 a week, maybe €800 a week. Or a month, sorry. That's an extra €500 per month. What's that in terms compare it to a wage increase? It must be 20 or 25% when you take tax and everything into account. I want the unions to stand up and fight with us for affordable housing. It's so vital to the economy. Look at the benefits as well. We're working out in Ballymun. We're only building 49 houses, but we will get more. There are 2,000 plots in Ballymun that would be suitable for our type of housing. And if you can introduce that kind of extra capital, let's use a bit of capitalism to help the economy. If you can introduce that bit of capital into the local community, we've done our figures. In 1 year, you could increase the income by something like 13 million. I'm gonna have a go at Rory later on. I'm gonna have a go at Jim as well. But I just want to say that, you can see I'm kind of annoyed and passionate about the housing thing. But it is an absolute disgrace. And I want more people to come on board and to support O'Coolan, even if you don't agree with everything that we're doing. But let's get affordable housing going in this country again. Just to let you know, we're building and selling a 3-bedroomed house 7.5 kilometres from the city centre for €170,000. You won't get it anywhere else. You'll pay 270 or 300 or something like that. Yes, there are eligibility criteria. Yes, there are all of these type of things, the clawback, which there has to be in there. Okay, but it's a start.
I'm going to take more questions. Thank you very much.
I'll just be very quick. My name is Gavin Bush. I'm a student. I'd like to ask the panel, what is to be done about landlords who refuse to accept social welfare payments like the housing system payment and can just refuse tenants who are very vulnerable, considering that we're looking into what was called generation rent.
Okay.
Thanks a lot. Kevin Connaughton is my name. I volunteer with the Social Democrats. Just have a question for you, Ethel. You said there about equalisation of pay for young people. It's a particular problem in the teaching industry. I know family members and friends who are of a certain age who are getting paid less than people a few years older than them. Is it realistic? Is it possible for you to achieve this, or is it totally aspirational? Because I'd be very sceptical that you can bring it about,
Okay, so we'll take those questions now. I don't know how we're going to handle the housing, but that was a comment. Okay, Ethel, answer the last question. That's the best way.
Yeah, there's nothing I disagree with on the housing comments. And just to say, I think for the record, it's important to say the trade union movement is actually very engaged on the housing issue. The march that Rory referred to on Saturday is supported by the trade union movement. The Irish Congress of Trade Unions is consistently lobbying on the issue. And the One Cork project has secured a commitment from the Minister and from Cork City Council to for a new scheme for social housing there. So it wouldn't be accurate. It wouldn't be good for anyone to take away the view that the trade union movement isn't very engaged on the issue of housing. On the issue of equalisation of pay for teachers, I can't comment on that. I don't bargain in the public sector. I need to restrict my comments to what I do myself, I think. But in the private sector, it is not easy. It's not easy because the employers resist it. But it's also not easy because in our wholesale retail distribution sector, we took a policy decision. led by our senior shop stewards and activists, to, at the bargaining table, when we were engaging in collective bargaining, to address the issue of pay equalisation for new entrants, but not just pay equalisation, but working conditions. Sometimes I have been standing in front of groups of members trying to encourage people to accept an agreement that does tackle the issue, but it requires a weighting of the outcome of the bargaining, including pay, towards younger people. That's not always a popular outcome with people who don't benefit equally from it. I would love to say that there is a very strong sense of intergenerational solidarity in the country. I don't feel that. I don't think anyone would argue it, that it's there actually. And I'd like to say that it was there in the labour market and in unions, but it's not always there, in my experience, in private sector collective bargaining. And sometimes we have really difficult conversations with our middle-aged and older members to say, hang on a second, young people are the people who suffered most in this recession. And we have got to do more for them in tackling the inequalities in the workplace. But we have achieved numerous agreements where we've done it, so it is attainable. I don't know about the public sector, but in the private sector, but it's not easy. But you don't work as a trade union organiser for an easy life.
Okay. Rory, would you handle the question on the two housing questions? I'm going to allow one more question there later in a minute, and that's it. We're going to break.
Very briefly on the example from Ballymun, I think it's a very good example of how affordable housing can be provided, and the point is, and the point that I made is that I think government and the state hasn't really been interested in putting support behind models like that, expanding it out, giving it the institutional support necessary, and that's the thing, that's the problem, that it's one area doing it or one model, one company is good, but that really has to be scaled out across the country, across the city, and it's the government, it's the state, it's local authorities that can do that and can support that, but that's currently not there, but it is what needs to happen. That's why it's important that you do highlight what can be done, the fact that a house can be built for 170,000, and of course, again, it's the big financial interest, the property, the whole, what I call the property industrial complex, which doesn't want people to know that housing can be built for that amount, because it undercuts the huge profits that are there. So it is important to highlight it. In terms of the exclusion, landlords can't exclude someone on the basis of being in receipt of a social welfare payment, in terms of they can't discriminate. So if you're trying to get a rental property and if you're in receipt of a social welfare support like the housing assistance payment, a landlord cannot say you can't view in this or you can't. They can't discriminate against you. But it does happen, of course, because the issue is enforcement and regulation. But there has been a case taken recently, a landlord was fined over that.
Okay, also,
I can respond after the second round.
Okay, fair enough. This is the last question or comment, and then we're breaking for lunch, I'm afraid.
My name is JJ Bunyan, and I'm from Wine County, Cork. At one stage in my life, I acquired a mortgage that confined me to a standard of living I had to endure to survive. And I reared 3 children and put them to college on a public service salary. Now, I'm a big fan of Rory. Don't always agree with him when I see him on Vincent Brown. Now, Rory, you spoke today about social investment. And I'm intrigued by a vocabulary of who will pay. Now, I want you as an academic to tell me, who are they? We have a new vocabulary now that's comprised of they and should. Who are the they and what should they do? Now, what is your solution? I'm promoting you now to Minister for the Environment. You're going to assist Owen Murphy, and you have a blank check. Now, I have determined that the issue is lack of finance. Where are you going to find the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow? How many autos are you going to win delivering Eurovision? Are you speaking from the rarefied atmosphere of a youth without any experience on the ground?
There you are, Rory.
Respond to that, okay. Yeah, I can say I don't live in a rarefied world. I live in a very real world. And I think that in terms of the finance, that first of all, I said the solution in terms of increasing the local authority funding, we could increase it, for example, if you don't cut the universal social charge, if you decided to implement a tax on wealth, if we decided to increase our general taxation level. It's there. The money is there to increase. So if currently, I said, in terms of actual figures, we spend about 300 million at the moment on actual direct capital building to local authorities. If you triple that to close to $1 billion, which is, as I said, is not a big amount, you could triple the amount of housing being delivered by local authorities. The other area is the Affordable Housing Company. And this idea, again, the money, and it's been outlined very clearly by the Nevin Institute, where the money for this could come from. And essentially, boiling it down very simply, it's based on a European cost rental model, which is that the rent that is taken in for the provision of affordable housing covers the cost of building. At the moment, that would provide rent much cheaper than market rents, because market rents are beyond what the cost of actual building. It would to cover the cost of building would be about $700-800 a month. Which is way below market rents. And it would require that money, the capital injection, to come from, for example, the Infrastructure Investment Fund, which exists. If you got about $3 billion from that, with the money is sitting there, it's what was the Pension Reserve Fund, it's sitting there to be invested. And then you would get the money you would borrow it using the Housing Finance Agency, using the NTMA. It would be a commercial semi-state entity, so the borrowing would be off the books. But irrespective of that, there's no reason why we couldn't challenge Europe and say, in terms of social recovery, Europe is now supposed to be supportive of investment, that we would get support to do this. So the model is there to do it. The question is the political will to do it?
A very good answer. And in fact, Rory also in his presentation showed you where there's another pot of gold, and that is we're pouring subsidies into the housing sector already in Ireland. It's just a lot of that money is badly spent. If we spent it better, it would be much more effective. But the last word to Oslam now.
I'll try to give a macroeconomic answer to this question, because there was something I wanted to say at the end of my talk. I postponed it to the discussion. Keynes has famously said, take care of full employment, the budget takes care of itself. Now, this is not a lax approach to budget. All it says is, if you generate full employment, well, let's say to that decent wages, full employment with decent wages, it generates the growth and thereby generates the tax revenues for the government. Even without increasing the tax rates, it does take care of the budget. Now, I would reformulate it for our time: take care of full employment for both men and women with decent wages, purple infrastructure in social care, health, education, childcare, green infrastructure in renewable energy, housing, transport. Have a progressive taxation. Yes, the budget is taking care of itself. So I try to give you the ammunition, hopefully with numbers. We crunch the numbers. The budget is the least of our problems. We have to start with the needs of our society. And we should stop thinking about the macro economy and the government as the household. The government has its own bank. Household doesn't, isn't it? We should be using monetary policy to achieve the goals we need. And then we have, of course, the taxation power. When we spend, we create the revenues, tax revenues with our spending, because we generate growth. And then we have, of course, the ability to borrow. When the interest rates are at its bottom low, we should certainly not be shy about borrowing for the good purpose. They will generate social equality, but also long-term productivity that ranges from housing. But I think we should stop competing different targets. They are complementary, and we have the ability to achieve all of them simultaneously. Yes, we can have decent social housing, decent social public transport, but also renewable energy, but also universal childcare, universal healthcare. Yes, we can do that. We can have universal education system. The last thing I wanted to add to that in terms of policies, how to spend, we need to think more creatively about having a national development bank, national investment bank. Europe was going in that direction, thinking towards it, but of course, Juncker's plan for a European investment bank is, as always, too little, too late, and we should be a lot bolder in these things. So my punchline is, yes, we can take care of each other, and there is indeed a magic money tree.
And I'd like to, and thanks again to